Welcome to Modern Education, where we discuss modern education. That is anything relating to schools, educators, and we oftentimes just have talks. But today we have a very special guest named Emily Bender. She works at Public Allies, a government organization, and she'll be in today. Dun, dun, dun. Would you like to say hello, Emily?
Hello.
So we kind of have an Emily party because this is your host, Emily Quiles, with
Emily Bender.
So we're just going to have a good time today. Unfortunately, Ben is out of the studio today, sick. So best wishes to our host, Ben. Hope he gets well. Keep drinking that water and orange juice, and hopefully you'll feel better. So, yeah, we're kind of just running this with two Emilys, having a little party in here. And we are here to... What are we going to talk about today, Emily?
Today we're going to talk about IEPs, 504 plans, and in general, just disability education within California.
Yeah. So this is a really big topic, I'd say, in general, especially in California being the California and Texas are the two big, education heads of the U.S. That basically what goes on in California or Texas kind of is what follows the rest of all the states of the U.S. So really, this is a great case study, I feel, that brings light to learning disabilities, how public schools, private schools deal with these learning disabilities through finance to just overall portrayal. And that's pretty much, why we're here today. I've known Emily, how long have we known each other? It hasn't been too long, but
a couple of months.
At least 4 or 5 months.
Yeah, something like that.
And I met her, you live in this awesome community house. Would you like to explain us a little bit about this house? What is this place?
Sure. I live in a 30-person housing cooperative in San Francisco. It's called Chateau Ubuntu. Essentially, it's a large house that's shared among all 30 of us. We share food, and we share spaces, and just in general, work together in order to operate as a household. We have a lot of different working groups, and just do a lot of and hold a lot of events together, and it's a great time.
Yeah, no, it's really awesome. I've been there a couple times. My sister lives there as well. And shout out to Catherine. And basically, last weekend, we had a murder mystery party. This honestly, it's the coolest house I've ever been to. It's absolutely beautiful. So yeah. So I met her there, and one day she kind of just gave me the story. And she was telling me a bit about IEPs and how in 504 plans, she works at Public Allies, which, do you want to describe what Public Allies is exactly?
Yeah, so essentially, Public Allies is a professional development and leadership program fostering essentially grassroots, teams of grassroots leaders.
Yeah.
And what I'm doing for the program is they place you with a local nonprofit in the Bay Area. And so I'm working with College Track over in East Palo Alto, and helping them with a few different projects. And mainly what they do is that they support high school students, mostly. They're national, College Track itself is a national organization, and they support students from first generation and low income communities to both get into and succeed in a 4-year college. And so it's a lot of supporting and working with high school students. And I ended up with them. So a little bit about my own background.
Mm-hmm.
When I was very young, I think it was in first grade, I was diagnosed with ADHD and a reading disability, and have spent most of my life moving through the public education, the disability the disability accommodations given through the public education system, which is known as IEP, or Individualized Education Program. And so based on a lot of that experience, I've been working with College Track in terms of helping that support students that have diagnosed disabilities who come to our organization, and looking at different ways that we can support their needs and look at macro pictures of, okay, like how can we adjust our own structures to support them better. And it's given me a lot of insight into kind of the state of where kind of disability services are within the state of California.
Yeah. So tell me a bit more about when you were using IEPs in high school, et cetera. Like, how was it highly accommodative, or was it like, was it like, what year was it exactly? Let's have that reference.
Okay. I think I was diagnosed, this goes back to 2002.
Okay.
And IEPs as a system cover you from, I think, from the time you're 3 years old till 22.
Okay.
And
that goes all the way into college.
Well, it goes all the way through the through the public school system. So through your time in high school,
college.
Not
so
through
this
college.
So this is good to say. Yeah. So basically, the IEPs only follow you through high school.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. But most colleges, especially colleges that receive any sort of federal funding, has to accommodate students that have disabilities, and most colleges have a disability office where you can go and say, like, hey, I have this long-term disability I'm diagnosed with. Here's all of my paperwork and my history, and you should be able to get similar accommodations, but that's a different thing. But for me, I was one of the lucky ones. I grew up in an area that had a really well-funded public school, and I had teachers that had noticed, even since preschool, that there were some things that I seemed to have certain issues with, that they brought attention to my parents, and that my parents also had noticed. And due to that, it's kind of how it started. That's how my process started in terms of being diagnosed and getting an IEP, which essentially, when I was young, included things for me in terms of, for example, I would be pulled out of certain classes and instead go to a resource room where I could get some more specialized support in terms of organization, in terms of management. I got to have extended time on exams, and that's mainly due to, like, my own processing issues. So that accommodation was to make up for those processing issues. And essentially, I was able to get a lot of support through these systems and through the systems that I was able to be a part of outside of that.
So how does, for example, having extended time help someone who's dealing with learning disability? How do these accommodations help someone who is struggling in school?
Well, if we think about the way that school is set up as a normative system, it's designed to accommodate a certain type of student whose brain functions a certain type of way. And to use for my own experience as an example, essentially what ADHD is that it's certain deficits within executive function which control your ability to, for example, regulate time management in terms of organization of resources, in terms of being able to process information and then articulate it back or to respond back accordingly. And so I had essentially a deficit where my ability to accomplish something was discrepant between the time that it should take me to do it. So by having extended time, it allows me to perform at the same level that someone without that deficiency would be able to do so. So it kind of essentially levels the playing field. So it's like if you think of the public school system as like a square hole accommodating square bodies, and then people that are neurodiverse or have disabilities are different shapes, And accommodations kind of allow to widen the hole a little bit in different ways so they can fit into
Which
that.
is so necessary in our public school systems. Like, I think, or just school systems in general. I think one of the best pictures that kind of show this is probably, I wish I could show you on air, but you're just going to have to bear with me with my voice. But it's I'm pretty sure a tree with a monkey saying, okay, climb the tree. And then there's like a fish. I can't remember all the animals, but I'll make some up. Like, let's say a goat, a dog, and the only one who can fully accomplish that goal to climb the tree is someone like a monkey who is made to climb the tree. A fish cannot climb a tree. And it was comparing, this image was comparing it to how school systems are, where it's like, it's just one objective, which is that end goal. And if you are not fit, not like that, but if you are not, you don't have that ability, it's not going to happen. And yet, because I'm even relating to myself, I did not have an IEP. I was tested a couple of times when I was younger because my parents were like, there's something wrong with her. Also, some teachers were just saying, maybe you want to check her. It turns out there's nothing. So I passed. Maybe, I don't know. If that was for the better or worse. But I struggled a lot in high school with attention, trying to, like what you're saying, organization. And honestly, just the fact of it, of that there are some resources out there which can make high school a little bit more tailored to you and who you are as a learner. It's just such a necessary, revolutionary type of idea, I feel, because for the longest time, it feels like learning disabilities weren't really talked about. And there overall seems like there's a stigma. Yeah. Do you think there is a stigma in
I think it's gotten better, but I absolutely do think that there is a stigma. I mean, in my own experience too, going through school, I mean, it was noticed that, I was taken out of certain classes, that I would be staying longer in the classroom on tests. Like, other students recognize this and, see it, and can be kind of isolating in just that it's kind of definitely, it singles you out. And it's hard in that, I mean, also the stigma continues today. And for example, there's a student that I work with in my placement who is diagnosed with ADHD, but is afraid to make that known to speak up and for her accommodations or to really use them because she's embarrassed about it. And as a result, she's getting in a lot of trouble because of issues of attention and being hyperactive. So it creates this kind of like this entrapping loop, and this entrapping, isolating loop for people that do have these issues.
Yeah. So would you say with the students that you deal with now, are a lot of them ashamed, or is this one specific case, would you say? Or like, what's the general feeling of these high schoolers? It's
honestly somewhere in between. I work with everything from, like, all of the students I've encountered. It's everything from certain students that are like, yeah, I understand this and this is how I am. I understand these are my accommodations. I'm an advocate about my accommodations and really understand it well, and are able to move through the system and don't really feel that affected by it. And there's that student I was talking about before, but most of the time it's somewhere in the middle, where there's students are like that, are aware they have these issues and feel almost bad that they have these issues, or that there's something wrong with them, and that they don't want to use these accommodations unless they have to, because they feel like that it's like their own personal failure, and it's like admitting to that failure if they use those accommodations, which is absolutely not true in any way.
Kind of twisted.
It is kind of twisted.
And that goes all off of like the social norms of our what is known, of what's normal, that state of, okay, if I'm not at this normal, then I'm not good enough. And I think that is one of the biggest tragedies within our school system. And it's just unfortunate that it has to be stigmatized still. And we were talking about this, I think it was a couple of weeks, or was it last week? I don't remember. But how almost there's like this uneven understanding where we've started to talk more about mental health, but a little bit less about learning disability. And not to say that they're the same, but I almost want to categorize them in a similar idea where it's like a brain function, or it's the way that we understand the world, and yet it's being described or at least looked at as lesser of a person because you have this. So just as a comment, really, I just find that interesting.
I know. And I guess also to clarify, learning disabilities are a specific category of disability. So learning disability would be something specific like dyslexia or dyscalculia. And dyslexia is having issues with certain issues with like decoding with reading and vocabulary, or dyscalculia, specific learning issues with math. But it can also incorporate things like having anxiety or having mental health issues that also would fall under the category of being able to qualify you for an IEP. There's actually 13 specific categories of disability that would allow you to be qualified for an IEP. And even if and there's other laws that will protect you if you don't exactly fall into that. But yeah, it all falls under the same kind of blanket.
So tell me a bit of, because you work with both private and public, correct?
Well, with College Track, our particular site feeds in from I don't remember the exact number, but we feed in from a bunch of different schools in the surrounding area of East Palo Alto. Mostly we work within the Sequoia Union High School District, so mainly public schools, but we do have students that come from a couple of private schools and charter schools. Okay,
so do IEPs or 504 plans, do they differentiate between public or private schools?
Yes, they do. So I think I should go in a little bit and explain a bit more about them. So IEPs came out of the 1990 Individuals with Disability Education Act. And essentially, they are protections that are guaranteeing that, okay, like as a student with a disability, you have a right to an individualized education that fits your needs and your ability to learn. And what an IEP is outlining what that is, what accommodations they get, what that plan looks like. And that's different from a 504 plan, which comes out of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, which essentially allows students to have certain accommodations. Like, let's say that you have something going on or a disability, and it doesn't exactly fit those 13 specific categories of that qualify you for an IEP. You might still qualify for a 504 plan and get accommodations like being able to get extended time or being able to test in a small room, but an IEP allows you access to special education funding and allows you to get, for example, like if you need a one-on-one aid, if you need specialized instruction, if you go to a resource room, if you have a case manager, that's all specially funded through an IEP that you can't get through a 504 plan.
Okay.
And IEP generally has more protections than a 504 plan. But those
what
are
type of protections? What do you mean?
In the sense of like that, they're much more stringently enforced than 504 plans. Like they have much more of a like legal bite to them. They also require certain things. Like, for example, they require a transitional plan. Like if you're in high school and you're going to graduate soon, once you become 16, you could become part of the IEP team planning process.
Okay.
But it requires like a transitional plan of, okay, this is what after high school looks like, and transitioning that person into like to be on their own as an autonomous like individual.
So there is a bit of a counseling going on. It's not just the accommodation. There is more behind the scenes, like catering to the student.
Exactly. Like it essentially like allows that student to have access to things that would require funding or require special education funding that 504 plans do not.
Okay, so what's the biggest difference, like you were saying, in private or public?
Oh, I'm sorry. Back to public or private schools.
Yeah.
So the way that it works is that it's the requirement of the school district to both, first there's this law called Child Find, which requires that public schools identify and evaluate students that have, that may have disabilities, and also to provide them with a fair and appropriate education that's equivalent to students that don't have those issues.
Yeah.
But private schools don't have that same. They don't have that same requirement. So most private schools, there's a separate plan that I don't remember the name of right now that you can get through a private school, or if you already come into a private school with an IEP 504 plan, most private schools will work with you, but they don't have to, and
Interesting.
they're not stringent to those
Is
same
that just
child find
because
laws.
it's not funded by the government?
Exactly.
Ah.
Exactly.
So you almost end up, I don't want to say disadvantaged, but you have less of an opportunity at a private school over a public school if you have a learning disability.
Well, it really also depends, too, on the state of where your public school's in. Because if you go to a public school that is having, I mean, there's a lot of documented evidence of stress among certain public schools where they end up not fulfilling everything they're supposed to do because of being, stretched with resources and with funding and with all of that. So it really depends on your context and where you're served.
Would you say that California does better than other states, or are other states? Do you know much about other states first?
To be honest, I don't know a lot about what the national picture looks like. But I think California in particular has a long-standing issues with fulfilling IEP obligations.
Yeah, so tell me more about that, because just before we got on air, she told me this big scandal.
Well,
which California Board of Education has gone to court about this.
Exactly. So there's these two organizations. There's the Morgan Hill Parent Association and the California Concerned Parents Association, which back in end of 2011, 2012 filed a lawsuit.
I have to say, I like how it's called California Concerned Parents.
Filed a lawsuit with the California Board of Education in regards to IEP noncompliance or special education noncompliance. And also why they were going to the Board of Education specifically is that at the end of the day, under the IDEA, it is the responsibility of the state education board to make sure that IEPs are enforced and that things are being fulfilled the way that they should be. And they, in particular, were lobbying that they had a lot of students that they were working with or families that they were working with that were saying, hey, this isn't happening. And there is a lot of cases from over the years of different high school districts being sued and sued successfully for not fulfilling that. So this lawsuit, so they sued them back in 2012, but it's only recently as of maybe the end of 2016 until now that they've started reviewing the actual case, because there was a long period of time where it brought up a lot of questions in terms of privacy, because the court, I think, was requesting, or they requested to unseal a bunch of IEPs to see, because you would have to look at them to see if they were actually being enforced, and it brought a lot of concern over issues of privacy, and curiously, it, in my opinion, was portrayed in a very misleading way, in that there was a lot of school districts, for example, that would put up disclosures saying, hey, there's this lawsuit going on that's asking for your child's, if your child is an IEP, it's asking for this information, but you have the right to object and refuse it, and that's okay. But without really explaining the full context.
Like why we need this information.
Why we need this.
I mean, it's almost perfect timing, too, where we are having this big, not just in education, but confusion, like, of how our data is being used, and this great fear of how the government is documenting it. It seems like this is kind of one of those unfortunate backlashes of our data where it could be used for something good, where it could progress for IEPs and 504 plans to be better executed in our schools, and yet people are saying, no, I don't want my data to be looked at. So has this overall hurt the, I guess, public awareness of what's going on in California or with IEP plans?
I mean, I don't know, I think, enough about the overall picture of that impact in terms of how it's been portrayed. My instinct is to say yes. And I mean, in the sense that also like that concern in itself isn't unfounded in that, for example, if we look at the ACT, the ACT up until 2010, if you took the ACT with accommodations, they would mark a little asterisk next to your, next to your score.
Would that be sent to colleges?
It would be sent to colleges and might impact the way colleges decide whether or not to take on that student, which is not legal.
Yeah.
And they were sued in 2010 and only since 2010 have stopped doing that.
Okay.
But in regards to this current situation with this particular lawsuit with the California Board of Education, it's different in that it's being used, the information's being used to address the specific problem with these specific officials looking at it for review. And I think that it's brought up a lot of questions in general of how that information is going to be handled and to be looked at. But the point is that it's really important in order to understand what is going on and what is happening or not happening. And that it bothers me that it's being portrayed as that, oh, like this is something that they're trying to steal your identity or they're trying to steal your kid's identity without giving the full picture of that there's this issue going on. This is what's, being, it
almost seems like a way to get out of it.
It is a way to get out of it. I mean, it's not in the school district.
California just be like, ah.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So, because you're also a little bit telling me about how there's a bit of a financial scandal in the way that we, or at least the way that public schools have been trying to test out children or high school students with IEPs into 504 plans, specifically public schools, because they don't have the funding, or maybe private schools. This is also, what are you seeing when you're working there?
I was specifically talking to you about that in reference to charter schools, because that's been something of concern. Yeah. And the way that charter schools work is that they, in exchange for being able to have like a bit autonomy and to operate separate of maybe the surrounding public school districts or the public school system, in exchange for being able to do that and get federal funding to do that, they have a higher standard of accountability, actually. So are actually are required to follow through like very stringently with 504 plans and with IEPs. And again, like I would have to go back on look at a lot of the data on this, but they're in general a lot of concern with charter schools and with public schools because IEP programs, students need specific accommodations that might end up being really expensive. And even though they do get funds, like public schools and charter schools do get federal funds to accommodate students with disabilities, but often those funds still aren't enough. And the resources are already being stretched thin. They might not have enough special education staff, and that having a student that could be okay with a 504 plan and having them a 504 plan is potentially easier for that school district to deal with or for that high school to deal with.
Yeah, no, I was talking to my mother about this, and unfortunately this happened to my little sister, and basically she has dyslexia, and this is down in San Diego. My mom was talking to, I don't know the specific person that you talked to about IEPs, but it's the lady that you talked to about her IEP. And they said, we wish that we could accommodate you for what you have, but we do not have the resources. We don't have everything that we should have to be able to accommodate you for this. And unfortunately, she had to get by without a full committed IEP plan. It wasn't a 504, still understood as an IEP, but there wasn't as much attention brought or resources brought that she could have had. And that feels like, because it's like that itself, just funding for public schools is an overall problem. It doesn't even have to be under the idea of learning disabilities. It's just, the way that teachers are being paid, the way of the textbooks. I guess now we're not really using textbooks anymore, but iPads and Chromebooks. So all of these online resources, if you're not in a very wealthy or privileged area, you unfortunately are getting the shorter end of the stick of what the government is giving.
Exactly.
And that is, I mean, if you know, I almost want to pose the question. If not, it's okay. Do you know how the breakdown is? How government funded IEP plans end up being broken down to cities or states, schools, school districts? Do you know?
That's a really good question. That's actually something I don't know the answer to.
That's fine. Just a itching question in the back. But
sorry, I was going to say, I think, funding and problems with funding play a big role. And a lot of that, where a lot of things end up not getting done what they should be, comes down to that the system depends a lot on advocacy of the parents and advocacy of the students. And if the parent doesn't fully understand everything and doesn't fully understand how the system works or what's going on or what certain things mean, it can, because it's very confusing and there's a lot to this process. That's where students can fall through the cracks.
Yeah. Actually, this is exactly where I wanted to go next, was the confusion on the parent side, because it seems to me that there isn't, whether that be from the administration side or the parent just maybe stigmatizing it, but it feels like there isn't much of a to B flow of information that is informing the parents well enough of what it means that their child has an IEP plan, as well as what it means after when they graduate and go to college.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I guess specifically to that, for example, there was one student that I was working with who had a diagnosed issue, and her school offered to give her a 504 plan, but that wasn't implemented because her parents were resistant to it, because they thought that it would negatively impact her chances of getting to college, or they didn't really quite fully understand what it meant. And once we were able to sit down with her and talk to her and explain things, she was then kind of on the same page about it. But it's tricky because there's issues of stigma, and that it stops students from getting the support that they need. And I mean, more and also speaking to that in kind of a more significant way, there was another student I was working with who had an IEP plan, and then I think transitioned schools, and was decided that they were going to transition to a 504 plan, but was asked if they wanted to wait first for 6 weeks, or suggested that they wait, and the mom was like, okay, let's do that, but then wasn't sure after that, no one contacted her or followed up with her, and also the person they had been talking to had left, so
it was just lost.
It was exactly she wasn't even sure where to start in turn. And meanwhile, because her daughter wasn't on any plan right now, wasn't getting accommodations, she was having a lot of issues with performing as well as she could in school, and was falling behind and getting in trouble with certain teachers, and that shouldn't have been happening.
Yeah, it's a great case study just to show how parents, it comes from the administration down to the parents, down to the child. It's just this flow of misinformation, miscommunication to actually performance of these students. So what would you say to a parent who is a little bit on the edge of either having their child have an IEP or 504 plan? What would you say to them to try to show them the benefits?
I mean, when I usually explain my own experience and how much it's been beneficial to me in that, because, at least for me, because of the supports that I got and then was able to continue to get through college, I was able to be really successful in a way that there's no way that I would have been otherwise. And that's through all the support that I was able to get, and that it's only something that can benefit your child. It cannot, like, the only way for anyone to know that your student has, or your child has an IEP or 504 plan outside of your school would be if you were to tell them yourself, or to release that information, or to release that information to colleges, especially. Like, the only way for colleges to know is if you tell them.
So they won't know.
They won't know. There is no way for them to know unless you tell them.
Yeah. So it's really just the bottom line of really communicating what an IEP is and what a 504 plan is at the start.
Exactly.
To lessen this confusion and maybe, hopefully, down the future, lessen the stigmatized feelings towards 504 and IEP plans. So, yeah, thank you. What would you, so let's say that you have someone on air or in their cars, maybe they're listening across the country, who knows, wherever they are, and they said, okay, I think my child, or I think I have a learning disability. What steps would you recommend to them to take to possibly get a plan?
That's a really good question. So if you're a parent and you suspect that your child has a learning disability or has something going on, what you should do first is, you want to document as much evidence as you can that could be able to show that. So that could be, for example, like, let's say you look at their report card and they do really, really well, like they're turning in all of their homework, like doing really well, they're participating, doing really well in classes, but on tests, for example, they keep getting really low grades. And that's a way to show, like, a discrepancy between their performance and ability within, like, a time space. Let's say you have teachers that have brought up concerns, like having teachers in writing, like, providing that input. If you have, I mean, importantly, really what they're looking for is that if you can get a medical diagnosis, and if you have a medical diagnosis, but in general, if you, and that's a whole other issue too. But in the sense is, gather as much evidence that you can in writing to show that you might have a learning disability, or your child might have a learning disability, and then you put in a letter to the special education department, or to the head of that department of your school district. Write to them saying that you are requesting an evaluation, and this is why. Attach any evidence that you have, and they're required to get back to you in writing within 2 weeks to say whether or not they will provide an evaluation. So this is the biggest part, where if you don't have a diagnosed disability, the school district under Child Find is obligated to evaluate you. If they agree with you, yes, this evidence shows that it seems like your child might have a learning disability.
So if you have a diagnosis, do you skip that part? Or does it go straight, okay, we're giving you the IEP?
Well, I think they have to say whether or not they will give you the IEP.
Okay.
But this is really important, because testing evaluations can run as high as like $2,000.
Wow.
Yeah.
So itself has a financial...
Exactly. So, but they're obligated to test that student for free.
Okay.
If they agree that, like, yes, we agree with you that they think we might have a learning disability, and so let's get you tested.
Okay, so if you don't have the money, there's a way.
There is a way.
Tested.
And the thing is, too, that if you do have the money, you can get independently tested at any time.
Yeah.
So, but the problem is, if the school district doesn't agree with you, then you're out of luck if you can't pay out of pocket.
Okay. Okay.
And there's a lot of ways that it does. There's definitely an economic, like, issue here. For example, also with, like, accommodations on the ACT or SAT, that has to be submitted independently. Even if you have an IEP or a 504, you're not guaranteed accommodations. You have to. There's a whole process of requesting accommodations, and I think actually the ACT board was sued and have recently redone overhauled the whole system. They did it because they were so stringent in giving accommodations. And so it takes so much time to prepare these, and then you might have to go back and it might be rejected and you have to go back again and it's expensive. And
so be persistent.
you have to be very persistent.
Yeah.
It's a lot of time, a lot of energy, and you have to be persistent and know a lot about these laws and how these systems work too. And it's complicated and confusing.
So if a parent heard this and was feeling disadvantaged, or not disadvantaged, but like, oh, okay, I'm not going to put my child through an IEP plan. That seems like too much work. I'd like you to, once again, kind of reiterate why it is so important for a kid to have it, because despite all of the issues with trying to get there, what is the advantage?
The advantage is that it's essentially giving your child the appropriate education that they deserve and the tools they need for success. And if they're not getting those tools, then they have a high propensity to fall behind or to have a lot more challenges than their peers in being able to get through the public education system successfully.
Yeah.
And I mean, yeah, and just through and having those supports can make a big difference whether or not you're able to learn and grow in the way that you should be.
Yeah, yeah. So you touched a bit when you were talking about diagnosis. I kind of wanted to backtrack a bit and talk about because you mentioned that there was a whole other problem with diagnosis. Could you explain a little bit more about that, about what the problems are? Is it through the medical side of diagnosis, or were you speaking specifically towards the school side?
Goodness, I don't remember exactly what that was in reference to.
Or at least in general, is diagnosis if you go through the medical field, like you go see a doctor and say, I am concerned that my child has XYZ, is the process with that very difficult to go through?
No, I mean, essentially what that person will do, and it's very different. Like, for example, if you're paying out of pocket and you go to a neuropsychologist, or I forget the exact title, there's a specific type of psychologist you would see who specialty is this. Yeah. But if you're paying out of pocket, I mean, they'll test your kid no matter what, but it's a different situation if you think something's going on and you are going through the school district, asking the school district to pay for it, and they say no. That can be there's a way to appeal that, and there's a whole process with that, but that can be challenging. Yeah, yeah. The process itself is that there's a whole round of specific tests that they give to test certain parts of cognitive function and memory, and essentially I remember being asked these questions, like, can you recite? They would have like letters or like sentences set out, and then you'd have to repeat it, like look at it, they'd hide it, repeat it. And I remember, long time ago, and I was really young, I remember being given a little purple puppet monster at the end. It was, as a child, really comforting experience. It wasn't intimidating, because I got that little purple monster at the end, and I was just saying things on a paper. So yeah, it's really, at least in my experience, unless they changed it, it's not that intimidating. No, it's not that intimidating. At least in my experience, wasn't that intimidating. It just, it's more of the issues have to relate to the cost of it, and to the problem is also that you have to be retested, I believe, every 3 or 4 years. Really? So to renew the IEP? Or is this just protocol? It is to renew the I think to renew the IEP, it has to be mandated that you're tested every 3 or 4 years, which if you have an IEP and you're going through the school system, that's usually, that works out okay, and that's all done within your school district. But, for example, for myself, I realized after I graduated college, for example, if I wanted to take the GRE, and if I wanted accommodations on the GRE, I would have to get retested and retested out of pocket because I'm no longer in the district system, but I have to prove that, hey, I still have ADHD. Yeah, it seems a bit strange. It's not like just one day you wake up and you have, ADHD's gone, your dyslexia is gone. You can learn to work with it, but it just doesn't disappear. Exactly. So why is it seems a bit strange that there's, you have to be retested every 3 to 4 years when something like a learning disability just doesn't go away. And I think, well, there are instances where people's brains change over time, issues manifest differently over time, and an issue that you've struggled with as a child, you may not be struggling with when you get older, or you may still have that issue, but it no longer affects you in to the criteria of what would require an IEP.
Yeah.
Which is also a problem in that you have to be, like, again, this comes back to the advocacy part, because if you're not persistent and you're not really an advocate for your child, an advocate for yourself, and using those accommodations, they might go away.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. So it's also a renewal process. It's not just the beginning.
Exactly.
It's not like beginning and it's checked. You have to renew it.
Exactly. It's something that's constantly, and then that's the advantage of the child too, in that it's something that is constantly reviewed. There's an annual IEP meeting where the team gets together and looks at, okay, like, has this person, have they met their successes? Have they met the goals that we set? Like, how are they performing in classes? Are they utilizing their accommodations?
Mm-hmm.
And all of that's looked at. Are there more things that need to be needed that aren't being utilized right now that we need to implement? Are there things that are here that aren't necessary and that can be removed?
Mm-hmm.
And that's both from the standpoint of, then, this is something that is like finances that can be used somewhere else, but also that if the child doesn't need it, then it wouldn't make sense to keep continuing with that accommodation.
I see. So what would you like, or how would you like to see IEPs, 504 plans being implemented in the future? Like, in this perfect world that you have in your head of how these things are, how learning disabilities are being catered to in schools, what would this look like, or how would you imagine it?
Whew, that's a big question. It's only in that there's so much. And I mean, the beginnings of this started off of, like, things the beginnings of this whole system started really in the 70s. And it's a long time ago. And even though, a lot of things have been amended and added since then, the roots of it are still in something that is, now out of date. And I think we really need to look at the way that disability in education is treated overall and really overhauled. I don't even know what that would look like, but I would first really love to see this being something that's much more known in a mainstream way, because the main issue is that so many people just aren't aware. Even people that have, like, students with disabilities just aren't aware, or mainstream school staff. And and that awareness is really key in order to
definitely
exactly
you need the awareness. We need to pursue it and
to make sure that it's enforced, and that I think that also having that be something that people are aware of and is talked about on the open helps, like, demystify a lot of that stigma too.
Yeah.
I mean, essentially, it's like the way, as I said in the beginning of our conversation, the way the school system is organized. It's organized for a very specific type of person, a very specific type of way. And so it's structurally a very imperfect fit for someone that has learning challenges. And so what it looks like to make that more equitable and more fitting to that person, I think would require a fundamental way of looking at how public education is organized. In terms of enforcement within the system, I think the biggest challenge, especially in California, is actually the follow through of those accommodations being carried out the way that they're supposed to, and that communication between parents and the schools are being carried out accordingly, and that being up to the way that it should as a start would be something that I would really love to see.
I hope this lawsuit that California's going through ends up with maybe some positive changes. I would like to thank you so much, Emily, for coming in. I think we had the best Emily party so far in the studio down in the basement. Thanks again for tuning in. All right. Thanks again again for joining us at Modern Education every Friday from 3 to 4 p.m., whether that be on your commute home, across the country, across the ocean, wherever you may be. Thank you so much for listening to us. We're here, again, every Friday from 3 to 4, and this is Stanford 90.1 KZSU.